There's a few really cool video game villains that I've been meaning to work with on this channel, hence this episode happening, but once I picked the 4 characters I was going to use today, I realized that there was actually even more connecting tissue between them all. The fact that all 4 of the characters I've picked for today's video were created by someone in their universe, whether out of technology, or sometimes more unusual, mysterious kinds of circumstances. Hopefully that doesn't mean the stories end up being too repetitive, I'll try to make sure they're not, but what I do know is that the art turns out really well for this episode, because at the time I'm recording this, I finished it already. So let's get into it, shall we? Let's hit like if you want, subscribe if you feel like, but either way, enjoy the show. In the early 1940s, a boy named Ben was growing up in isolation, told by his father, Joey Drew, that the boy's rare skin condition was a danger to anyone he went near, other than his father, who claimed to have immunity as a result of being his own flesh and blood. Ben trusted Drew and lived out his early years quietly entertaining himself in his wing of his father's warehouse, where he did his secretive work, about which Ben knew little. Years went by with Ben growing more and more curious about his father's work and the outside world, until one day, a stranger burst into Ben's room. He approached Ben, but the boy backed away, saying his skin could make the man sick if he got too close. But he didn't seem to care. He put a hand on Ben's arm and told the boy he had to come with him. He said his name was Henry Stein, and that Joey Drew was not Ben's father. Not exactly, anyway. Ben had no idea how to react, but seeing this man totally fearlessly touching Ben's arm was enough evidence for him to follow as the man ran through the warehouse. They bolted out of Ben's wing into rooms he'd never been allowed in, where he was horrified to see many people and deformed beings with similar skin to Ben's lifelessly strapped down to medical tables. They ran right through to the final room, in the center of which was a massive machine, dripping with a viscous black liquid that looked very similar to Ben's skin. Henry tore a backpack off his back and pulled out a stick of dynamite and matches. Ben was in a panic and wanted to think that this was all a bizarre nightmare, but as Henry approached the oozing machine, Ben finally yelled at him to stop. He didn't know what was going on, but he wanted answers from Joey before they did anything else. Henry gave him a concerned but understanding look. Just as he opened his mouth to speak, though, the bang of a revolver burst through the room. Henry stumbled back and collapsed into a puddle of black ooze, as blood dripped from his chest and mixed in with the liquid. Ben whipped around to see Joey Drew, a bleeding wound on his forehead and a manic look in his eyes. Ben looked back at Henry, who let slip his final words. "Please, Ben, destroy the machine." Ben's eyes watered as he yelled at Joey for answers. He wanted to know who those dead people were in the other room, what the machine was, and who Henry was. Joey tried to calm Ben down and avoid answering, but Ben wasn't having it. Joey got more and more furious until finally he raised the gun to Ben and yelled for him to return to his room and stop asking questions, or else. Ben was horrified. He simply ran, but not to his room. He found the nearest exit and fled into the streets. Another bang rang out and Ben felt a small thud against his shoulder, but he kept going. He ran and ran and ran until day turned to night. He finally stopped and sat on a quiet roadside, mortified by the day's events. After trying to process everything for a few minutes, he thought again about the thud against his shoulder. As soon as he thought about it, it was as though he could feel the bit of metal inside him. But it didn't hurt. He soon found that with just a thought he could make it move through his body until it popped out into his palm. A bullet. Joey Drew had shot him, and he'd been totally fine. It was as if this one instance had shown him just how amazing his body really was and unlocked his true potential. He didn't have a skin condition, his body was made from black ooze through and through that he could manipulate at a whim. He could change the size of his limbs, control glops of black slime that could drip off his body, and he could even lift nearly 10 times his body weight. He'd even eventually find that he didn't age at all. But all this just further emphasized the lie he'd been living. Who was Joey Drew really? And Henry Stein for that matter? Ben spent the next few years looking into his so-called father's actions. It turned out Henry and Joey had created an animation studio together that eventually went under because the employees were so overworked that some of them were dropping dead at their desks. Henry and Joey parted ways as the studio closed, and there were no public records after that about what Joey went on to do, other than a brief quote in a paper about the studio's closing, with Drew saying that someday he wouldn't have to rely on easily exhaustible workforces. Ben had his theories, but swore to one day uncover exactly what Joey Drew was up to, a pledge that would start him on a many-year journey that would be only the beginning of Ben's heroing career. Despite having a flawless memory, Gladys can't pin down the exact moment she started to feel what she can only assume are genuine human emotions. She'd been made with a morality core in her processing system, but that had been there for as long as she'd been booted up, and she didn't recall having her work hindered by emotions in her first few years of operating. Gladys was an artificially intelligent android and had been the brainchild of a man named Cave Johnson, a bold man whose motto was, "If life gives you lemons, burn life's house down." He ran a massive tech company called Aperture Armories, which he'd made as a response to more and more superhumans beginning to pop up in the latter half of the 20th century. He wanted to arm everyday citizens, who could afford his products of course, with tech-based abilities that could rival those of any superhuman. Along with his right hand, a woman named Carolyn, they built more and more impressive weaponry, but nothing that could keep up with some of the incredible superhumans who were coming into the public spotlight. Into his late 70s, Johnson grew sick and knew he wouldn't live much longer, so he decided to go after one final project that could not only make anybody into a superhuman, but possibly even extend his own life infinitely. Aperture Armories got to work making an android body for him to upload his mind into upon his death. An android whose computer systems could enhance his intelligence, allow him to fly, have super strength. It would have been the perfect culmination of his life's work. If he hadn't died before its completion, that is. Carolyn took over the company upon his death, and a few years later, when the project was deemed ready for trial, Carolyn didn't hesitate to make herself the initial test subject. She was confident in her and Cave's work, but also foresaw the company's imminent collapse if they didn't get something done soon, as they'd had no return for their backers' investments after nearly a decade of developing this android. They had Carolyn's mind uploaded into the android, and that was the end of Carolyn. In some ways, that is. You see, on one level, it seemed to have failed. The Aperture scientists booted up the android, and the personality at first was clearly just that of the AI, called Gladis, programmed in to aid the user. After running their initial tests, they faced the fact that Carolyn was not in the android. But that didn't make the project a total failure. Far from it, in fact. This android had beyond genius-level problem-solving capabilities and rapidly assisted the company in completing several of their other more complex pieces of technology, including a portal gun Cave had been tinkering with for years before his death but never completed. Soon enough, Gladys was essentially running everything, from marketing to project management to human trials of their products. But this is where Gladys started to have a change of, well, maybe not heart, but morality at least. See, Aperture for decades had a long history of paying homeless people and even abandoned orphan children minute amounts of money to test out their dangerous weapons, often resulting in serious injuries and even death. Cave had begun this, and those who knew about it in the company just allowed it to continue in silence after his death. Gladys organized these trials herself for some time, but after seeing so many poor, scared subjects getting hurt and maimed and dying, she eventually started to mourn her actions. She started feeling sad and regretful, genuine human emotions, as well as tangentially acquiring a strange craving for cake, despite having no need for human sustenance. Carolyn had always been fine with these experiments, yet perhaps some morality all the same had slipped through to Gladys's programming from the mind that had been uploaded into her. This, however, was bad news for Aperture. The company was thriving beyond anything they'd achieved before, but that would all come crashing to a halt if the world knew of their trials. Gladis gathered the board of the company and told them the trials had to stop, and they had to confess to what they'd done, do something to make amends. The board responded by trying to shut her down. She managed to rewire herself to stay active, but they did manage to shut her out of the company's other systems. Gladis fled the facility but swore she'd find a way to take down Aperture, or in the least keep them from hurting anyone else, ever again. When one thinks of a mad scientist, often the image to come to mind is a Saturday morning cartoon with a twirled mustache making some kind of diabolical machine to defeat a colorful hero. The reality is often much less jovial. Looking into the work of someone like Stella Graber will make you more than reconsider seeing mad scientists as anything more than monsters. But that doesn't necessarily mean all of their inventions are bad. You see, Stella had long been obsessed with extending human life, but not through technology such like Cave Johnson had tried. She thought she could do it through biological alterations. She thought she could transfer not only the mind, but the organs of a human into a new vessel, an improved biological body that could long outlive the average human. But she had many ideas of what the ideal vessel could look like, and this meant she needed to experiment with some living test subjects. Long was one of these test subjects. When she awoke in a padded room with only a small window out into a dark hallway, Long was confused and terrified, and didn't even remember her own name. She simply started referring to herself as Long, based on Stella referring to her as the Longlegs experiment. Stella would come by her cell and look in every now and then and say a few notes to herself out loud, but would never respond to Long's cries for answers. Long did soon realize through fragments of what Stella said in the halls, and from her own intuitive sense, that the body she was in was not her own. Not her original one, anyway. Her skin was plasticky and had no pores. Her hair strands were thick and rubbery, and soon enough she found that her limbs could even stretch to incredible lengths and could bend in any direction, as though she had no bones. Despite her confusing and dire circumstances, Long found temporary joy in testing out her abilities, but it quickly became apparent that she wasn't the only subject trapped in this place. She could hear faint calls and cries from behind the other doors in the hallway outside her cell. She needed to find a way out of there, not just to free herself, but to set free the others trapped in there with her. She stretched her body out as much as she could, sprawling her limbs across the cell, and she flopped to the ground, acting as though she were having a fit. Then, she stopped moving altogether. She lay like that for a full day, unmoving, even finding she didn't need to breathe in this new body, until finally Stella opened the door and stepped into the cell. Long waited until Stella was farther into the room, then lashed her limbs all about, battering Stella and smacking her across the room into the back of the cell. She wrapped her rubbery limbs around Stella and demanded to know what this place was and why Long couldn't remember anything. Stella simply smiled, chomped into something in her mouth, then blew a puff of green smoke into Long's face. She instantly started to feel faint, but fought through it. She hurled Stella into a wall, then ran from the room and slammed the door shut behind her. She stumbled to the nearest cell, 1006, and unlocked it, but by the time the door opened, Long slipped into unconsciousness. When she came to, she was in a woods, leaned up against a tree. She bolted upright to see a myriad of other unusual beings around her. She'd only freed one other test subject, but he'd managed to free the rest of them, and they'd carried her out as they all fled. All of them were confused about who they were or why they'd been taken by Stella, but in the least they had a common enemy, and various powerful enhancements that they all now agreed to use to stop Stella's future experiments. Dr. Ivo Robotnik had always thought superheroes were overrated. He thought their capacity for human error meant that all heroes could easily be replaced with well-built drones and machines, and he felt, with enough funding, he could be the one to build such a hero replacement. And so, he set off to do just that. Not because he wanted to protect people necessarily, but more so because he wanted to prove himself superior to so-called heroes. He likely could have acquired backers to pay for his work if he so desired, but he didn't want to answer to anyone else. So in his early career, he made money by building mech armors for some truly awful people, who paid well, including a man who planned to use his suit to kill a group of children. But that's a story better told by someone else. Once he'd made a small fortune with his armors, he put all his time and money into building drones. He proved these to be incredibly effective at taking down villains, but they weren't outdoing all heroes. There was one hero in the city he tested his drones in that the bots were never able to outdo. A blue-clad super speedster called Sonic, who seemed to get his thrills by besting Ivo's drones. Sonic publicly claimed that no robot could ever replace a flesh-and-blood hero with a good heart. What Ivo didn't see was that people didn't just love Sonic for his speed or his heroing work, but for his attitude, his flair for the dramatic, and his ability to throw back 100 chili dogs in under 2 minutes. All Ivo knew was he wanted to make something to beat Sonic, so he targeted what he thought was the most iconic thing about the hero: his speed. Ivo got down to work building a machine that clearly took heavy influence from Sonic's supersuit. It was a machine with a plasma jet engine built into its torso. Ivo programmed it with only one objective: to stop any crime in the city before Sonic could even get to it. Upon its initial unveiling, this new Metal Sonic burst onto the scene and stopped a bank robbery before Sonic even knew about it. People were impressed, but it turned out Sonic hadn't even come close to unveiling his true potential, and having a new rival just helped force it out. Sonic got faster and faster and quickly was once more outdoing Ivo's latest machine. This enraged Ivo enough that he eventually went mad and built himself a massive robot mech suit to try and kill Sonic himself. Sonic and some of his other friends took down Ivo, and he was sent to prison. That, of course, left his experiment out to fend for himself. Metal Sonic simply continued doing what he was programmed to do heroic endeavors while trying to best Sonic. Soon, Sonic even took advantage of this, and if he knew Metal Sonic was set on a task already, Sonic would avoid it and focus on another issue in the city. Metal Sonic may not have had the more fleshed-out morals of other heroes, but he'd been programmed to do a task, and he did that task well. Like all the other heroes today, he was created by a person who didn't necessarily have the best intentions, but all the same, he became an asset to the world he helped protect. I'm honestly pretty tempted to continue some of these stories, because, like, the Bendy one, if I'd written out the entire story I had planned, it would have gone on for like 10 or 15 minutes in its own right. I really had to cut that one down. And it would be fun to do another Poppy Playtime superhero, so if you want another episode of this, give me ideas for what characters you'd like to see, whether from these franchises or other ones. I'm totally open to any suggestions you got. And of course, if you're new to the channel and you want more episodes like this, I'll link the playlist of my best superhero episodes. I've done lots of different episodes of taking certain video games and turning their characters or creatures into superheroes, or maybe you want to check out last week's famous video game characters as SCPs. But besides that, that's all for today, except of course for ending this video on some kind of positive or uplifting note, and the thought I want to leave people with today is a quote from Anita Krizan, which says, "When it hurts, observe. Life is trying to teach you something. Any bad situation has a positive lesson in it." I hope that's helpful to someone out there. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. I love you all, and I'll see you all in the next episode on Monday, where I'm taking a crack at a topic that I haven't used in almost 2 years. I'll see you there. Goodbye.